Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. My name is Zachary Strong and I am a physicist, psychology researcher, biblical scholar, and TTRPG designer. And in this video I'm going to be talking about a structural problem that I've seen in other popular tabletop role-playing games and how I'm attempting to address that structural problem. So, as the title of the video implies, I see some problems with intellectual stats and intellectual attributes in tabletop role-playing games. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a couple of case examples of why I see this as an issue, and I'll also be talking about what I'm doing to address this issue in a game that I'm developing. So, intellectual stats. If you look at Dungeons and Dragons, the character sheet, you'll see that some of the main stats include intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. And in Vampire the Masquerade, very similar. You have charisma, intelligence, and so on. And it makes sense why we would have these things. It makes sense. Like, I understand the design logic behind it. But for me as a role player, one of the things that I really thrive off of in games is immersion. Immersion. And so that means that the game world and the characters within the game world have to be believable, and they have to be acting in believable ways. And the problem with intellectual stats and social stats like intelligence and charisma is that this actually makes immersion somewhat difficult. Okay, and I'll explain to you what I mean. So, let's say you are playing a wizard in Dungeons and Dragons, and you've got an intelligence score of 18. And maybe you've got a high wisdom score as well, like 16 or whatever, right? Like you're high intelligence, high wisdom. Those attributes require you to behave and portray your character in accordance with those attributes, like high intelligence, high wisdom. And I get that for a lot of people, D&D is just a fun thing. They don't worry about immersion too much and so on. But for me, immersion matters. And so if I'm in a game and I'm playing alongside somebody who has a high intelligence, high wisdom character, and they are not behaving in high intelligence, high wisdom ways, it breaks immersion for me. And it kind of spoils the fun a little bit. Right? And so what I realized over my time playing D&D and a large-scale game of Vampire the Masquerade is that players are limited in their ability to portray certain things based on their own attributes, like the player attributes, and also their understanding of things, right? Because if you have, say a modestly high intelligence, like, we'll say in the real world you have an intelligence of 14, right? Like maybe you've got an IQ of 110, 120, and you are trying to portray a character that has an IQ of like 140, right? You're not going to be able to do it. You're not going to be able to pull it off, right? And that's just an immersion problem, right? And especially for wisdom, right? Because wisdom is a very elusive thing. Even like high intelligence people, like scholars and so on, they don't necessarily have wisdom. And so a lot of people don't even really realize what a high wisdom stat would be, right? Like if you are playing a character with wisdom 18, it's like, how do those people think? How do those people engage with the world, right? Like it's qualitatively different, right? And as a psychology researcher, I know this, right? Because I've studied wisdom, right? People who have high wisdom scores engage with the world in very, very different ways. And so it becomes very difficult as a player to portray that accurately if you haven't, acquired that level of wisdom or at least familiarized yourself with how those people move through the world. Now I'll give you a bit of a practical example. So in the 2010s and late 2000s and 2010s, I played in a 30 to 40 person game online of Vampire the Masquerade. It's kind of like a digital LARP, okay? And in Vampire, if you're not familiar with the game, you're playing vampires, and some of those vampires are 100 years old, 200 years old, or older, and you're engaged in long-term intrigue, right? Because with vampire, when your lifespan is like 500 to 600 years old, you might have plans and plots that take 100 years or more to pull off, right? Which is very different from the human world, because most of us think in terms of like months, years, and maybe even like a decade, right? So it's an entirely different mindset, an entirely different way of being, right? And for me, when I played Vampire, um, I had been involved in student politics for a little while, and also, like, I was involved in marketing and sales, and I was interacting with CEOs and CTOs and so on. And so I was able to bring a lot of those skills and mindsets to the portraying of my character in the game, right? Because when you're involved with, you know, high level executives and student politics and so on, it gives you a certain level of ability to engage in intrigue, manipulation, and so on, right? And so I was able to bring that to the game. And one of the things that consistently broke immersion for me in that environment was that a lot of people who were portraying, these crafty vampires or whatever, they did not necessarily have that experience. They didn't know how to play the long game. They didn't know what long-term intrigue might look like over the course of years or decades. And so their characters did not move appropriately in the game. A lot of things were very, very petty, I found. Like, people would just pick fights over stuff. And it broke immersion for me, because it's like, if we act in this way and we aren't coordinating long term and manipulating things and so on, like, the secret society of vampires that we're trying to portray, like, it would not survive in the real world, because we are not behaving with the levels of wisdom and long-term thinking and so on that are required of beings that are 100 years old and trying to survive for more centuries, right? It just breaks immersion. And similarly, as I discussed, like, if you're trying to portray a character with 18 intelligence or 18 wisdom, right, which is almost superhuman, and you yourself have not familiarized yourself with how those kinds of characters would move through the world, you're not going to be able to portray it. And so anyway, that's one of the issues that I see with the mental and social statistics and attributes that are on these character sheets, right? At least for me, right? Like, because for some reason I really value immersion and so on, and so I just pick up on these things naturally. For a lot of people, D&D and Vampire, it's a bit more of a casual thing, and they're just having fun casting spells, slaying dragons, collecting loot, and so on. Like, that's totally fine, right? But for me, that was something that I picked up on as kind of an issue. And so in my TTRPG design work, I've tried to think about, how can I get away from that, right? How can I get away from that? And so let me just pull up what I've come up with so far. So, as you might imagine, one thing that I've done is remove things like intelligence and wisdom and so on. I've removed those from the character sheet that I'm designing. You're not going to find necessarily intellectual attributes on my character sheet. What I have so far is power, which is basically, basically strength, agility, which is basically dexterity, vitality, which is basically, constitution or stamina. And then instead of intelligence, wisdom, and charisma, I have attention, focus, and presence, which are still, intellectual mental stats, but they don't require players to have the same level of skill that you would need to portray high intelligence, high wisdom. Like, if you have a low attention stat, your character is going to be a little bit more scatterbrained and so on. And same with focus and stuff. So it's easier to kind of put yourself in the shoes of the character and portray it accurately. Now, the second thing that I'm actually doing is I'm planning to bake into my game. I'm planning to bake in things approaching self-development literature. So if your character accesses, a new feat or a new spell or a new skill, I'm going to include some real-world resources that expand the player's perspective, right? And my hope is that that's going to give players the ability to expand themselves and grow themselves while playing the game, and therefore be able to portray their characters in more interesting and deeper ways, right? And if you look at my website, zacharystrong.net, you'll see I've got a whole bunch of guided journals available. So I've produced guided journals on critical thinking, wisdom, reflection, social skills, and so on. So I've actually been developing real world resources. And I plan to bake some of that into the game. As players discover lore, as players advance in power and so on, or their characters advance in power, they'll be unlocking resources that help them show up in the game world in ways that drive immersion and also allow them to have new skills and stuff that they can use in real life. So that's kind of how I'm addressing, the problem that I've, ranted about in the first half of this video. What I see is difficulties when it comes to immersion. That typically comes from asking players to portray things that they don't actually know how to portray. And so my solution is twofold. Not asking them to portray, high intelligence, high wisdom or whatever, and also giving them resources that allow them to portray their characters in new ways. Anyway, that's the TTRPG design blog for this week. And just as an update, I've, in the TTRPG that I'm designing, what have I done? The dice system seems to be mostly done. The combat system is roughed out. The character sheet is roughed out. I've developed feats and skills and so on. So a lot of the core system is now roughed out and moving on to playtesting. And, the cosmology, as I discussed in the first video in this series, the cosmology is mostly done. I'm doing some world building right now. So overall progress on the game is going quite well, and I'm excited to share more about what the game actually is and what it looks like. Hopefully in the coming few weeks. Anyway, thanks very much for following along with my TTRPG design adventures, and if you have any questions or curiosities, sound off in the comments.